Today we welcome to the house Alessandro Gerosa, a cultural sociologist currently working as a researcher in the University of Milan after a stint at English universities. Prior to that, from 2012 to 16, he served as a city councillor for the Italian municipality of Monza. His recent book, The Hipster Economy, Taste and Authenticity in Late Modern Capitalism, is a provocative genealogy of authenticity that has led to the movement we call hipsterism. Gerosa grapples with the way authenticity becomes easily commodified, which we see in the superficial use of terms like artisan and handmade with love. More importantly, he confronts squarely the elitism of hipsterism, evident in the high prices and the rarity of taste. This echoes issues in previous talks raised by Kamya Sharma, I'm pleased to see you here, Kamya, about the sari, Linda McIntosh on Lao royal craft, Ezra Shales on industrial crafts, and Tulika Gupta on the British influence in elite Indian menswear. We look forward to hearing how he resolves this contradiction of an anti-consumerist movement that seems to have become an exclusive fashion. So welcome, Alessandro. Greetings.
Welcome to you, and thank you very much for the invitation today. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful being here. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm really looking forward. This is probably the presentation that I've made that I'm more, looking after for, because seeing such an array of practitioners and scholars is absolutely wonderful.
Well, thanks for your time. But tell us, you seem to have a very neutral background. Give us a bit more sense of where you are in the world and what your day is like.
Well, yes, I have a neutral background today because I'm I'm connected from home. But yeah, like I am connected from Monza, Milan, in Italy. So actually a territory that has a long-term involvement with craft. No, I am in the province in Italy, which has probably, the most long-standing history of traditional and heritage craft, in Italy, and a very long tradition of small and independent artisans selling their work, especially with, in terms of wood, furniture making, and in terms of yes, the manipulation of some materials. It also influenced by what in Italy has been called at the beginning of the 28th century liberty style, which resonated with what in a more Anglosphere was the arts and craft movement. So it's been particularly interesting also in my work to observe having this kind of background and having this kind of economic landscape. It has been very interesting in my research, to compare what I was researching about these kind of new forms. I call them neocraft forms, more focused on more ephemeral objects of consumption like food and drinks and beverages, and instead these more classical heritage forms of craft. Because naturally, and this is one of the interesting things and one of the conceptual troubles that I faced, and that I'm still facing, because unfortunately I do not have, as many as almost all scholars, I don't have big answers, but I have, ongoing questions, how to deal with these tensions, if you want, between, what are the continuities and what are the tensions instead between these different forms of craft, which I think is very interesting. You also mentioned, that you had the previous scholars which faced these as a guest speakers here who faced, the issues of class and taste, which is something that I deeply related to as well, looking at heritage crafts.
Yeah. Alessandro, just to give people a sense of the very interesting description and genealogy in your book about neocraft and hipsterism. And at this point, I should say, if anyone has any questions or would like to come in, this is an open house, so please raise your hand or say something in the chat that we can respond to. We're open. But anyway, Alessandro, tell us, for instance, where the word hipster comes from, because we're perhaps so familiar with it, we've lost the sense of what it actually means.
Yeah. Well, like in my book, there is this a little bit of a paradox now that I've put the word hipster straightforward into the title, and this probably has also went useful for because it make it pop and quite popular and quite catchy. At the same time, I always say disclaimer: this is not a book about hipsters, in the stereotypical terms of the hipsters. No, if it was like that, my book would have been, already obsolete before coming out, because if you search hipster and dead on Google, you will find probably dozens of articles saying, oh, well, the hipsters are dead, etc. Here, however, in my book, I refer more to hipsterism as a much more diffused and paradigmatic ethos of consumption. And so to do this, I traced a genealogy, to come more directly to your question, of hipsterism and to be hip. And well, if we look at the last 75 years, we discover something that we often discover if we adopt historical approaches to social phenomena, that basically, well, the hipsterism was appropriated by Afro-American culture, fundamentally, because the first and original, if you want, hipsters, if naturally original or authentic, can have a meaning in this context, was actually a subculture born just immediately after the Second World War in America from Afro-American people, and was basically, a way for Afro-American people to oppose and to counter the WASP American society of the 40s, vindicating that naturally they could have an aesthetic too, they could have, a distinctive style too, they could have good old Bourdieu would have said a distinctive cultural and symbolic capital too. No, and this was the original hipsters, and this tells us a lot about the idea of authenticity. No, I mean, being authentic and distinctive has always had a very broad and generic and abstract meaning, to the point that in the academia it's also very controversial. No, many scholars will say, well, it's so abstract and generic that it doesn't make sense to use it. Still, I think that what it is interesting is especially this essential meaning of and that we can already grasp from its use by Afro-American communities in the 40s, of being something expressed in a position, as being an aspiration to express yourself in opposition to the dominant and to the dominant structures and styles of society, which are perceived as dominating and oppressing herself. And indeed, from being used by Afro-American community, then it has been appropriated in the United States by other white countercultures that were also opposing the WASP societies, and that it generated, the long wave of hip countercultures, hip subcultures that then flourished and exploded with the revolts of the 60s and the 70s. And from then on, and then I will stop, we had instead a second fundamental shift, which has been that from then on, the hip has not become any more associated with a counterculture or a subculture, but it has become a new mainstream and a new paradigm of consumption, which has also led the current resurgence of craft and the artisanal.
Well, I think it's wonderful how, a genealogy helps us return to the origins, and in that perhaps see something beyond what's become something quite ironic now in terms of hipster, like, the revival of toast, for instance, in San Francisco cafes, this continual search for something common but elusive at the same time. One of the neologisms, if I may say, that is in your book is the neocraft. Can you define what neocraft is for us?
Hopefully I can. Otherwise, no, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, this was again because um, we could observe in my research, I could observe, the resurgence, and not just in my research. I mean, anyone who would walk, I think, in a medium-sized to a large-sized city, at least in the global north, but not only in the global north, now also in the global south, can see these multiplication of artisanal shops, artisanal street food makers, and of bars and restaurants based themselves on ideas and concepts of artisanship and craft. At the same time, as a scholar, so looking at the craft literature, I pretty much immediately understood that there was some friction here, because basically all the traditional craft literature was based on heritage and traditional craft. And there is some big and pretty important difference between heritage craft and what I was seeing. Now, again, in my book, I take a lot of historical approach, and to develop both genealogies and comparisons. And in my book, at some point, I write that probably if William Morris would return today walking in the streets of a large European city in London today, he will be probably at the same time very pleased, because he will see again, a new resurgence of craft businesses, very much inspired, knowingly or unknowingly, by the arts and craft movement principles. But at the same time, he will be probably also very much bewildered, if not, estranged, because the craft to which he referred were the traditional craft, the making of durable objects of extreme artistic quality, of very high artistic quality. While today, if I will probably ask, to the audience or to people around, which has the craft products that are leading the neo-craft resurgence, probably it's craft beers, in the US at least. The very idea of beers being a craft can be very controversial. So basically, we conceptualize the idea in the book, also in other scholarly work, of neo-craft to express this difference. That is not a way to naturally distinguish and oppose the things, but to specify that this new wave of artisanal urban economy has also some differences, is led by a new wave of micro entrepreneurs, of small and independent retailers, which are led by the idea of producing something artisanal and producing something which is slightly distinctive for everything else that is on the market. But this idea of craft has much more to do with the symbolic dimension of it, and with the affective dimension of it. And it has also to do with two elements. The first thing is the skills involved. To produce an artisanal piece of food or of drink requires generally is something very difficult, don't take me wrong, but it requires in general less expert mastery of artisanal skills than the production of an artistic piece of furniture or of any of the heritage crafts. And the second aspect relates to the final costs. Again, if heritage crafts remain like this kind of hipster economy, hipster urban economy, producing artisanal food and drinks, still remains, more accessible to a general public, and this also explains its lack and its multiplication in the neighborhoods of the global north and beyond, because it still remains some way more accessible than, again, to buy heritage craft products, which remain more exclusive if we want.
Yes, well, I think this gets to the central critique that you detail in your book, Alessandro, which is about the way in which in neocraft, with the, as you call them, the micro entrepreneurs, there is a symbolic contest of consumerism by seeming to go against the trend of fashions for more processed and more technological and more novel forms, to do something in the more, even if it's not heritage, at least traditional vein, like the particular craft beers or artisanal cheeses that perhaps evoke and go back to older recipes and so on. But the critique that you look at is that this is actually not it's not confronting the system. I think you used the term, it's a meso level kind of activity. It's working within the basic format of capitalism. And therefore it has it's limited in terms of its, what you might call its radical potential to be able to offer a different perspective or an alternative to the system that we're in. Is that right? Have I characterized it correctly?
Yeah, no. I mean, well, naturally, I mean, as every economy, also this kind of economy works and lives inside a capitalist system, fundamentally. And so it has to deal with that one way or another. Naturally, it's always important, I think, to never essentialize in a unique block an entire economy. Obviously, in this new craft economy, there are many different stances, many different people approaching it from many different ways. Now, in my research, in my interviews, because this is based on empirical research that I conducted now in the city of Milan, there were people who opened a new craft business because they were political activists from 20 years. They've done all kind of public manifestations, autonomous social centers, and at some point they found this the best compromise to keep on making a change in the world while also paying the bills. As I found, naturally also plain entrepreneurs which had a shop, which had a restaurant already, and they understood this was the next big thing. And so that they wanted to intercept this to make more money. Obviously, these different tensions live inside the same, sorry, I think I got, okay, coexist inside the same economy. Because obviously enough, there are both as in every phenomenon. I think that what is interesting here is to look at these like at the neocraft economy naturally as a contexted terrain between different perspectives. I always found myself in presenting this work, presenting my book in one of two situations, having to defend them from comments, saying, well, they're clearly just a posture, they're just, hypocritical, they're selling overpriced burgers just for that, and defending them to actually, highlight how there are deep ethics and deep values underpinning a lot of them, and they actually care to, and they actually, sacrifice a lot of economic profits for that. Or at the same time, I found, demythicizing them in front of comments, that idealize them, saying, oh, well, this kind of urban hipster economy is the next big thing because it will revolutionize everything. It will change the world. And I was saying, well, no, let's also consider the nuances. No, I think it's important to recognize both aspects as every phenomenon. I mean, I mentioned already, the arts and craft movement. And they're really saying that this is a sort of a new wave of arts and craft movement. But at the same time, if we look at the debate of the time, William Morris was a socialist. He saw the arts and craft movement, as a way to overcome capitalist production and to envision a socialist future. At the same time, he was himself very much criticized, because the arts and craft economy that he spearheaded and he proposed actually was also quite exclusive, could be also quite exclusive and available and accessible only to a certain categories of the population, which is the same tension that we're seeing today with the arts and craft, with the neo-craft economy.
Well, I think
I've
as we're
also seen
kind of
one comment, then I don't know, but
well, I think we can get to that, but I just thought it would be good for those of us trying to understand your perspective, Alessandro, if we jump ahead to where you conclude in the book about what you see as being a sign of what might distinguish what are worthy versions of neocraft, or ones that you would see as being of interest versus perhaps the ones that are more commodified or cliched. And as far as I can recall in the book, you focus particularly on the social connections, embeddedness in terms of its relationship to political issues and so on, the way in which neocraft opens a space for people to come together and interact directly, not via large corporations. So it has that sort of immediacy that can be politically quite important. And I'm just wanting to check with you if I've characterized it correctly. And also, in particular, if you've got examples, because I think it would be very interesting to understand, where you see the radical potential in this.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, you characterize that correctly. As everything, I mean, I was saying at the beginning, I don't have, easy answers on how to make, the new craft economy radical force for good, and to avoid it being commodified. I think, again, this is an ongoing conflict, but as always, as in all the fields, I think the first answer always lie in collective. No, the collective dimension. To no solution can come from individuals and either individual realities. What I think is very interesting is that many of these neocraft businesses also consider themselves, in terms of services for the neighborhood, and to also be a nexus in the social fabric of the neighborhoods. I interviewed bars, that conceive themselves as a space for moms of the neighborhood, providing a lot of services, or a community making hub for mothers and neo mothers in the neighborhood, but also, and what I think is very interesting, I encountered there many neocraft entrepreneurs or food truckers thought of developing networks to promote a certain kind of philosophy, certain kind of values, and I think that there lies the potential power, because again, the main weakness of the neocraft economy is its strength. That is the symbolic power that they hold. The fact that their attachment to craft is majorly symbolic, because again, what makes preparing a burger or preparing a cocktail an artisanal activity and not just a manual, low-skilled activity? It has a lot to do with the symbolic component. This same element is their weakness because it exposes very, very easily to commodification by large corporations. Now, in the book, I make the example of McDonald's launching their artisanal burger, but we can see this just going in any supermarket. I don't know about in Australia, but if you go in a supermarket here in Italy, you're basically assaulted by waves of industrial products that try to convince you that they are crafted and they are artisanal. And they clearly aren't. You some way know that they clearly aren't, but still they are more, you buy them more if they have built well enough their promise of artisanal, of being artisanal. And so you can only overcome this risk, and at the other side, you only overcome the other risks, because we know that in community making from below lie the risk of retail gentrification of the neighborhoods. Behind producing high quality cocktails or food and street food lie the risk of aestheticizing and making and selling food at exorbitant prices, and an aesthetization of traditional food cultures. The only answer to this comes, I think, from the collective dimension, from networking and from developing common discourses around this, because it's all a conflict field, and conflicts, you can only win them together.
Thank you,
Never thinking
Alessandro.
that the individual can be a solution.
Well, that's a very positive way of casting the conclusion, and I maybe can see the possibility of a follow-up book that could explore some of these ventures. I certainly identified very strongly in my neighborhood, which has got a wonderful local ecosystem of bakers and roasters and barbers and knitters and so on that connect together. But we've got a couple of questions that are very interesting. One from Susan Luckman, who's previously presented here, who is the co-editor of Craft Communities and has written many books, and I think can have an interesting perspective. But before we go to Susan, I wanted to read a comment from our dear friend Ben Leniel. Unfortunately, his connection is not good enough to be able to say it directly, but I think you can all see it in the chat.
Yes.
He says, "Dear Alessandro, your focus on food as craft is exciting as it expands on a relatively understudied aspect of craft. Does the study of hipsterism encourage craft scholars to examine intangible rather than tangible cultural practices? Does that also mean that the definition and production of the symbolic, in this case, depends on consumers rather than producers?"
Yeah, I mean, it has more. Yes, I think it has a like, or at least naturally, there is a element of symbolic in everything, probably in every kind of production, I will say. But here it's about a different and maybe more, again, the symbolic component of craft takes the main stage, arguably, I will say. So yes, I will say that, well, for me, surely it has meant to focus more on the intangible, or in the ways in which the intangible and the material connect together in different ways. And I think that it here, between the consumers and the producers, well, I mean, one thesis in my book is that, yes, I mean, fundamentally, the rise of these urban neocraft urban economies depends from the rise of, again, hipsterism as a paradigmatic regime of consumption, and of the idea. At the same time, it also it's the neocraft economy also relates to a connected process from the viewpoint of producers, because it relates a lot also with a new wave after the one that we witnessed in the 70s of autonomous workers trying to find, in autonomous work what they can't find in employee white collar jobs. A lot of the people I interviewed were people who had quite a high cultural capital. They had a degree. Many of them worked for corporations or large companies, and then they underwent the same kind of process, that David Graeber illustrated in Bullshit Jobs. They said, okay, like, my work is truly meaningless for me, and so they went down to this kind. They decided to become autonomous workers, and to open a new craft business was their best way to find meaning in work. On some aspects, before it was, again, the easiest way. Well, this may be also about Italy, but in Italy, everyone has some kind of, oh yeah, my grandma prepared this kind of food in an excellent way, or I have learned this signature dish from my hometown. I know it very well, so I will replicate it. So it's easier to become a neocraft entrepreneur producing food than, again, that producing furniture, because that requires years and years of experience before you can actually sell them. And on the other side, because naturally they were also passionate consumers of that of that product. So obviously enough, it was very so it was natural. So they are connected. But yeah, I think that the original thing was more led maybe from the consumer side.
And just to put a footnote in there, one of the interests we have in the house is from a global perspective, looking at craft cultures that aren't necessarily focused as much on the commodity as maybe in the West. And this work has been done particularly by Leila El-Hamad, who's in the house at the moment, looking at the role of scent in Middle Eastern cultures being, of course, something that, because it tends to be burnt, is not necessarily something which has the longevity as, say, a ceramic vessel or a textile or anything like that, but is embedded in the kind of rituals and ceremonies of everyday life. And so that's become something of interest to us, the intangible nature of what we're dealing with. I'd like to now invite Susan to ask her question and to join us on screen. Welcome, Susan. Good to see you again.
It's been at least 3 days. Lovely to see you again, Kevin. And hello, Alessandro. I've written a question there in the chat, and you can probably access that. But I'm just interested in the question of class that you briefly referred to in the book, and especially how you refer to the erasure of working class histories, which I completely agree with. But I'm just interested in the way in which often the aesthetics or the idealized aesthetics of working class histories of making often come into the symbolic relationship of neo-craft. I'm thinking of, at least from the Australian perspective I'm familiar with, when you think of a hipster, you almost certainly think of a male rather than a female. There's a particular kind of stereotypical look, which is particularly gendered. And I'm also thinking of the visibility of making and the way in which industrial aesthetics have become hyper-stylized in particular ways in the neo-craft economy. So I'm just interested in that particular class relationship there, and if you have any further comments to make on that, please.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you because, well, I mean, naturally, your work has been one of the major inspirations for this book, so it's particularly welcome to, obviously, you know, to have this question. So thank you very much. I wanted to say this. So yes, if I got so on the relation, well, for sure, the class dimension is huge. I mean, to begin with, all these neo-craft urban economy is mainly a middle class phenomenon. Knowing that, naturally today, the middle class label has a little bit deflagrated and exploded. So now it means something much more diffuse than before. No, now when we talk of middle class, we know that it's something that goes from people that actually struggle to pay the bills, but are urban, creative, and cultural workers, to people that actually are, but for sure, it is a middle class phenomenon. And I think this has a lot to do also, and this has been particularly understudied. I think I hinted it sometime in the book, but this has been understudied, how this paradigm of consumption based on the idea of, you know, hip and art, hipsterism and art and craft is influential, for example, in the new political ruptures that we're seeing. No, and in a sense of deep exclusion that large components of society can feel from being excluded, you know, from the reputable and legitimate people having the legitimate taste of the artisanal, you know, and still. So this is something I think particularly interesting that hasn't been looked enough yet. In my book, I speak of the, you know, the dialectical relationship of, you know, the hipsterism and kitsch aesthetic. You know, where with kitsch, I do not personally use it in a negative way, even if it has acquired a generally negative connotation. But for hipster, it has been the same. No, hipster now is mainly employed with a negative connotation, and that is interesting in itself. No, with the kitsch aesthetic, I refer more to an industrial aesthetics, no, a pop, if you want, aesthetics, which were more typical of a Fordist capitalist configuration, and that had its appeal. Now, I mean, now a more artisanal or hip aesthetic of consumption is so ubiquitous that it may seem completely crazy for younger people, no, to think of it. But industrial products had their very strong allure. No, to consume industrial products was synonym with being part of a movement of progress toward modernity. It was equaled with, you know, being something, consuming healthy stuff, no products. No, there are many anecdotes. No, in the 50s you will see Italian housewives, cooking hamburgers with the plastic foil, because plastic, it's industrial, it's good, it's healthy. You didn't even consider that, and you didn't want to consume the food from the authentic food from the countryside, because that will mean to still associate yourself with the past, with archaic forms of consumption that you wanted to distance yourself from. And I think that the kitsch and the authentic, and the dialectical relationship between them, both in terms of aesthetic and both in terms of actual consumption, still dominates pretty much the consumption landscape. Also, naturally, in the actual forms of consumption, because again, we may all want to consume fully artisanal products is still a privilege. No, we may then maybe many of us can probably achieve, or to better say it, apologies. No, I will rephrase this. It's still a privilege if you live in an urban context. It can be or you do specific life choices, returning to the countryside, etc., or in the urban context, it become pretty much a privilege. And so what most people do is to find their own compromises. You take some food and products from the supermarkets, you take them, you pair them up with some other kind of food from, I don't know, your local grocery maker, etc. So yes, I think that this kind of tension pretty much dominates. And then naturally, and sorry, now I will end, but there is also the element to which you referred of appropriation of working class heritage, which is fundamental, I believe, because obviously enough, the urban hipster economy, neocraft economy, is a little bit obviously a play of disguises. You want the authentic traditional food, but you don't want the really traditional food that was prepared 1 century ago. Because, the traditional food 1 century ago from my territory was extremely greasy, was extremely fat, was extremely poor in terms of calories intake. People will probably get disgusted to have the real. So naturally, you want upscaled, gourmetized versions of it. But obviously, in upscaling and gourmetizing these kind of dishes, these kind of preparations, and at the same time presenting them as the authentic forms of it, you are doing working class erasure. No?
Can I just invite Susan to share with us perhaps an Australian perspective, given the work of Jess Stein, the recent conference, All Hands on Deck, and Susan, your report on the value of craft in Australia, which is perhaps tied more towards industry in the sense of certain skills like boiler making, pattern making, that perhaps are seen as heritage now, but still may be seen as an important part of the overall industrial ecology, and perhaps maybe separate to the symbolic politics that being represented by hipsterism.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Thank you, Kevin, for the invitation. One of the things that strikes me there, Alessandro, and thank you very much for your response there. I was thinking of some of the things that Kevin's just talked about in relation to generationalism, because I remember it too. Not literally from my own, I'm not quite that old, but I do remember in the similar thing happened in Australia in the 1950s and 60s. Plastic is new. Manufactured is good, it's safe, it's what you go to. It was the thing that marked you as different. But I'm interested in your work. I can see a new generation's perspective on things, and I'm now sort of a generation since. And one of the things that Jessie Stein's work is working with heritage trades workers and noting their ongoing contribution to the importance of making in Australia, but also noting the fact and ways in which we offshored most of our manufacturing in the 70s and 80s, and we're losing that layer of expertise that is absolutely fundamental to knowing how to hand make. So I actually think I'm going to put it back into a question rather than make a big statement. One of the things I'm interested in here too is, in Australia, part of this nostalgia is because we have that distance from manufacturing. So I'm interested as somebody who's working in the part of Italy where you are, where there's still a strong history or strong presence of making, if you see any differences in places that have lost that manufacturing/making history versus places that have retained it, or is it sort of just a flatness that we see across of the aesthetic across all different kinds of sites that are more around generations in age rather than histories of making practice? I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I think it's an excellent question. I think that if for some reasons they got lucky in doing my research in the Italian context, no, because I think that again, what is peculiar about Italy compared to other contexts like it can be Australia, or the UK that I know more than the Australian context is that we had a very short and concentrated industrialization process. Like Italy basically got heavily industrialized between the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s. And then it got, deindustrialized like the rest of the world between, between the 80s and the 90s. So in some way, like we could see the process in in real time in terms of academic knowledge and production. And at the same time, the process was extremely intense and heavy, but at the same time, it was easier to reconnect, with the kind of previous kind of style. And I can definitely see the difference. Again, unfortunately, I cannot do a direct comparison because I don't have knowledge with the Australian context, but with the UK context that I think can be a little bit more similar, with a country in which industrialization has taken place over 2 centuries. That you can clearly see the difference with that, because in that case, the erasure of the working class tradition, food tradition, etc., is almost total. And it's extremely difficult to recover them. While in Italy, just in terms of small and independent retailers landscape, for example, in Italy, there has been much more a survival of some. And so on that remainance, now a neocraft economy has developed much more easily compared to other contexts. Food traditions, like there have been some food scholars which have calculated the amount of food preparations that we lost during the central decade, and they're still very important in Italy. Now I can't remember the numbers naturally, but precisely, but it's still a huge amount, but still it's much less than we can observe in other contexts. And I think that definitely has a big influence, yes.
Thanks,
No, thank you.
Alessandro. I think it's in the time we've got, it'd be terrific to hear different perspectives from other countries. And I know Kamya Sharma is here. It's hard to tell in the ether how easy it is for somebody to connect. Kamya, are you there? Kamya has been doing interesting work on the kind of generation that followed Gandhi in India, who are associated with like the crafts councils, who venerate the handmade and traditional artisans and look down on those whose saris are made with polyester and chemical dyes and so on. And I guess what she's troubled by is the sense of the way this reproduces caste within India. And there is a movement, particularly for traditional artisans, to aspire to luxury markets. So that sense of elitism, which seems to contradict very strongly that of Gandhi, is something which people are kind of raising questions about in India. Are you familiar with that? Have you got any perspective on that?
Well, I unfortunately not directly, I have to admit, but I mean, I'm listening with extreme interest to these other perspectives. I mean, I think it's very interesting to look at these different contexts because again, we talk of. I think it's important to see, Sorry, I don't know if she's there. If you want to intervene directly.
Oh, hi.
Yeah.
Hi, Alessandro, and hi,
Hi.
Kevin. I'm sorry that my camera is switched off. I'm kind of on low bandwidth internet at the moment. Thanks so much for your talk. Alessandro. I was just, yeah, there is actually a lot to engage with, but I was specifically wondering, in India, if I think of the Indian context, a kind of recurrent concern has always been that craft moves from being community-based or caste-based livelihood to something that operates entirely out of the studio. And so there are people who express anxiety about this. There are people who say, this should be the direction that craft should be headed, so that individual craft producers are given their just due, which often that labor is invisibilized when it is painted as this kind of community-based livelihood. But yeah, obviously I see that, in that kind of transition, there would be perhaps an element of gentrification, perhaps an element of like the kind of late capitalist ethos that I see in your work as well. But I just wondered if you had any thought about this.
No, yeah, I mean, it's very, very interesting. And again, I think it shows very well how, again, if like one of the things that I was happy about when my book went out and it had, it's 5 minutes of notoriety on Twitter. So people from many different countries saw it and, engaged a little bit with it, is that from many different contexts, I had a feedback of, oh yes, I'm seeing the same trend toward craft also, in my context from very different parts of the world. And I think that in the moment in which this kind of, new ethos of consumption, this new paradigm of consumption became sort of globalized, it's extremely interesting to see how it differently develops, in different contexts and basing it themselves on nesting itself on different craft cultures as well. No, I think it's very, very interesting, the case that you're like illustrating. It reminds me, the communal dimension of crafting, it reminds me a lot about some Italian traditions in this sense. You will have in Italy, text make. I'm sorry, now I can get a word but producing clothes, producing. It was a very much communal thing that was made in a very diffused way. In my territory, it was pretty typical to have, each one to have a small textile machine in their flat, and sometimes doing that as a side gig. But at the same time, unfortunately, this got lost, and so this is very much excluded from this new wave of near craft. Now, it's interesting instead if this is interacting in a different context and to analyze how it is interacting. At the same time, again, I think it's very interesting to look to these push to luxury craft, and at the same time, or more middle class like forms of craft. Again, it's interesting to look at these differences and like how and why in one context there's more element to the one and or to the other. So
yes,
like
I think it does pose a challenge in our field, which has been very much geared around the studio movement and therefore individual practitioners to give value to the collective and the embedded, as you and Kamya are talking about. Can I just also invite in now and perhaps put on the spot Leila Al-Hamad, because I'm just curious in terms of Kuwait, putting it in the context of the Gulf countries. We see craft there very much associated with nationalism, a revival of pride in one's distinct cultures, whether it's Emirati or Saudi or Kuwaiti. Do you see a similar sort of social divide to what Alessandro is seeing, or is it a different sort of dynamic at play, do you think? You're on mute, I'm
I
afraid.
think it is.
Thanks, Kevin. Ciao, Alessandro. I split my time between Milan and Kuwait. So when I'm in Milan, if you don't mind, maybe we can meet and I can meet you in person. That would be great.
Very, very happily.
Thank you. So no, I've been thinking about this conversation. Obviously, I haven't read the book, so I might have a lot of lacuna. But I work a lot on the sense of smell. There's the rituals of scent in my part of the world, which is Kuwait and the surrounding areas, and how the sense of smell and has in a way been marginalized in the global conversation on craft. And yet in my part of the world, it remains very much a part of the culture. And these rituals go beyond just smelling something, but they go in terms of the involuntary memory that Proust invoked, that so many of the rituals of hospitality that we have, and also the rituals of the dead, the rituals of marriage, etc. So I've been working a lot on the marginalization. At the same time, what was marginalized was the sense of smell, has now been commodified by the West in a very, in a way that I find very unfortunate. Because, for example, if you take oud is the wood that we use in order. It's aloe wood that comes from South Asia and that we burn. And we use it in perfume. We use it as the base of all of our perfumes. It's now been appropriated by, let's say, the neo-craft movement in the West. And they are now pushing it on everybody, including us. So there's a sense that what you're talking about, there's so many different levels of complexity to it, because from our perspective, it's a form of appropriation. You've taken something that is very dear to our rituals, and you've turned it into just a commodity that everybody can smell. And everybody now in the world becomes an expert on the sense of smell, whereas they don't have the basis for it. You know, it's like me appreciating Italian cuisine as a non-Italian is different from you understanding what the centuries have gone into it. So I find that this flattening of this hipster movement, the flattening of craft, which is meant to be local at its origin, but then has become global and has created this global taste, this indifference in the taste, really. Everybody can have the same cup of coffee. Everybody can have the same meal here and there. And this flattening is what makes me, let's say, the most let's say it's the part that I feel the worst about, because I feel like it cheapens craft and it actually devalues it. And there's a power dynamic going on here, again, between the global north and the global south. So even with the small artisans that you have, this neo-craft movement, there's an imposition of a power structure over the south. So sorry, I hope I'm not sure.
No, absolutely. No. I absolutely agree. I mean, I absolutely agree. It is, thank you for this intervention, because I think it's fundamental. I think we see it at all sides, also in internal economies. I mean, you know, like the Italian food culture is very, you know, as you know, is very proud and a closed system, if you want. No, so we're much more dominated by regionalism than by exotic food. But at the same time, you can see this thing about the Italian North and the Italian South that pretty much mirrors the kind of global South and global North that you can see at a global level. I agree. I think that there is a deep tension between the senses. Again, no, the smelling is a fundamental component of the neo-craft economies in regaining, you know, the idea of authentic smelling and intense smelling, if you want. At the same time, we can see its commodification. We can see how there is this tension about the senses, because let's think, and we haven't touched upon this, but it's huge, about social media and the aestheticization of food on social media, where naturally the component of smell, not only the component of smell naturally pops away, but also there is a totally different relationship with the senses, because what becomes fundamental naturally is not the taste of the food, but it is the ASMR sound of the preparation that goes well with the earphones, or the bright colors of the dish, no matter what the taste is. Maybe it's, I don't know, it's some detergent to make it more bright, but it is what it is important. So yeah, I think that there is a lot also here to unpack.
Thank
you very much,
Leila. There's a lot more
there are
to
two
say
other
about that. There's a
questions.
couple of comments to go before we finish up.
Yeah.
Firstly, to Ben Lignels, I won't read it all out, but essentially he's saying that he's asking the question to what extent we're working within a more of a semantic field in terms of the use of various words. When you think of various single origin coffees and the way artisanal and other words get attached to products, and he talks about practices and cooking practices in France, which were.
I mean, there
I'm very
is
familiar with
I
that.
will I like there I don't think it has been led by a sort of linguistic phenomenon, to be fair, but certainly the linguistic component has an important role in it, because obviously, again, if this hip aesthetic regime of consumption is founded on ideas of authenticity and distinctiveness, then naturally a part of it is to semantically express your uniqueness and your authenticity by crafting something unique. Now, a typical thing in Italy is to combine, for example, titles pertaining to the very old traditional retailing landscape, mixing it with new things. No? So I don't know, the battery of design, or these kind of elements, that combine different elements together to give a sort of a unique taste and a unique turn. I will not say that this has been led by a linguistic phenomenon, but for sure, this phenomenon involves a linguistic component, a semantic component, again, because it deals with the symbolic. And
Sure.
obviously, the linguistic is a big and relevant component of the symbolic.
Which makes writing about it very important because it's
yes.
a way of teasing things out. Finally, I wanted just to see if Nadine Bonsai would like to make her comment because she's a new person to the house and is speaking as a craftswoman, and she's asking if there are other Substacks or socials that reflect this kind of conversation. I don't know if Nadine wants to enter. But anyway, let me say for Nadine, certainly Garland Magazine is very much designed around the maker's voice. So that's something, even though it doesn't touch on so many of the theoretical issues that we've heard from Alessandro, it certainly tries to understand the kind of the ground of making, where, what, who, why is occurring, and finding the universal in the particular, the way in which that attention to detail can lead to discovery of something new. And certainly at the house, we currently have a consortium of organizations that feed us information about what's happening. And we're just about to embark on individual memberships so that makers and thinkers can sort of connect and share their work. So please join our mailing list and stay in touch with that. And finally, I think Ben's comment about neocraft consumerism and suspicious connoisseurship maybe encapsulates the dilemma. It's a similar one in philosophy of the hermeneutics of suspicion, the way in which a whole critique of civilization with people like Freud and Marx developed in modernity leads us to the question of, where is the solid ground? What do we hold on to? When everything, is a scam, everything is fraught. But I think, what you've offered us, Alessandro, is the enzyme to cut through a lot of the fat of consumerism, to be able to understand, what the bones that holds things together would be, which in this case may be the collective, the social, the local, and working through that and finding a place for that of the studio movement, how to align them in some way is going to be a very interesting challenge for us. But I thank you so much for sharing with the house and all those who have contributed to this conversation. And I invite you very much to join us for the next Talanoa, as our Moana friends call these kinds of conversations. Thank you very much, Alessandro. We look forward to that second book on collective craft.
Yeah, Why not? Thank you for the idea. No, thank you very much for this opportunity. It has been really wonderful to have this dialogue. It was one of the most, again, one of the most challenging but rewarding, absolutely, these conversations that I had. And well, that's where us as academics get excited, when we have these opportunities to speak with a mix of practitioners, scholars. So thank you very much, and let's keep in touch absolutely for everything.
Okay, thank you.